So we're all set to go to war with Iran, but it's not clear why or what exactly our goal would be. A line I heard recently was that we're kicking off a war in search of a strategy, which seems kind of fitting here. In fact, statements from the administration over the past few days seem to be testing what argument for war is best received by the American people. So as the massive U.S. military buildup in the Middle East continues and quite a few countries urge their citizens to leave Israel and Iran immediately, let's look at why, in their words, the Trump administration is about to kick this off. Now, I think it's worth starting with some statements made by President Trump at the State of the Union address a couple nights ago, where he kind of led with, it's the Iranian nuclear program. They can't have a bomb. Here's President Trump.
After midnight hammer, they were warned to make no future attempts to rebuild their weapons program, and in particular, nuclear weapons. Yet they continue. They're starting it all over. We wiped it out, and they want to start all over again. And are at this moment, again, pursuing their sinister ambitions. We are in negotiations with them. They want to make a deal, but we haven't heard those secret words. We will never have a nuclear weapon.
Now that, of course, is one of the reasons that we're having these negotiations and all of that. But in his terminology there, saying we haven't heard these magic words, just a few hours prior to that, we heard the Iranian foreign minister, Araghchi, saying, quote, Iran will under no circumstances ever develop a nuclear weapon. Now, whether you trust Iran in that capacity or not, laying that out as something that they have to accomplish is strange because they already accomplished technically checking that box of saying those words. Then a day later, we had Secretary of State Marco Rubio talking about how Iran right now is building the capability to put together an ICBM, or intercontinental ballistic missile, with the idea of trying to strike the United States at some point in the future.
They're trying to achieve intercontinental ballistic missiles. For example, you've seen them try to launch the satellites into space. You've seen them increasing the range of the missiles they have now. And clearly they are headed in the pathway to one day being able to develop weapons that could reach the continental U.S. They already possess weapons that could reach much of Europe, already now, as we speak. And the ranges continue to grow every single year exponentially, which is amazing to me. For a country that's facing sanctions, whose economy is in tatters, whose people are suffering, and somehow they still find the money to invest in missiles of greater and greater capacity every year. This is an unsustainable threat.
And this one caught a lot of people off guard. I mean, we immediately had a number of folks say, we haven't really heard that threat before. We know about Iran's regional capabilities, but trying to hit the United States isn't really something that's been a major topic of conversation. In fact, NBC said, quote, it was the first time the president or any U.S. official has portrayed Iran as poised to develop an ICBM. Until now, U.S. intelligence agencies and European governments have said that Iran could eventually build an ICBM under the cover of its military space program if it chose to. A Defense Intelligence Agency report released last year said Iran has, quote, space launch vehicles it could use to develop a military viable ICBM by 2035 should Tehran decide to pursue the capability. They added that a U.S. official told NBC News that Iran has been building towards an ICBM for years and making advances, but there was no indication of dramatic new progress. So again, the thing I want you to focus in on here is there are a bunch of different reasons, and we'll get to those in a second, why the United States might want to go to war with Iran or might kick off military action with Iran. What's weird is we're seeing a lot of things referenced that are kind of pretty quickly pushed back on. Adding to that, we have the idea that Iran is enriching uranium, working towards a bomb. And to this, less than a week ago, we had Special Envoy Steve Witkoff saying they're getting close. They're continuing progress, and they're getting close.
You know, they say that it's all about their civil program, and yet they've been enriching well beyond the number that you need for civil nuclear. It's up to 60%. They're probably a week away from having industrial grade bomb making material.
But again, in response to this, we had a number of organizations, this one put together by the Wall Street Journal, saying most nuclear experts disagree. They say Iran's atomic program hasn't advanced significantly since the United States and Israel struck its 3 main nuclear sites last June, according to experts and diplomats, despite Washington's top negotiator saying Tehran could make fissile material for a bomb within days. They quoted three different individuals here. First off, David Albright, a former UN weapons inspector and president of the Institute for Science and International Security, saying, quote, viewing the satellite imagery and monitoring the Iranian nuclear sites, we don't see any evidence that they are trying to reconstitute their nuclear weapons program. They are essentially on hold. Robert Einhorn, a former State Department official for nonproliferation issues and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, said, quote, there's a general conclusion today that there's a de facto suspension of enrichment. There is no enrichment taking place. They added that, and then they added Gary Samore, a director of the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis University and a former White House official on weapons of mass destruction, saying, quote, it is possible that Iran has machine tools and materials, spare parts hidden away somewhere, and that might allow them to reconstruct a small centrifuge facility. But as far as we know, they haven't done that. And this is where I'm having a hard time kind of absorbing all of this information, because we know there are legit reasons, viable reasons, why the United States might want to kick off military action with Iran. I mean, just in the last couple months, we had the killing of the protesters. That doesn't really seem to be making it into anything the administration is talking about right now. If anything, we're hearing they killed the protesters, so we know they're bad. Also, look at these other things that we have to take care of in a timely manner. ICBMs that could reach the United States, a nuclear program getting ready to build a bomb. And of course, we had an Israeli official earlier this week talking about Iran pursuing chemical and biological weapons that could be strapped to their ballistic missiles. There are legit reasons, I think valid arguments that I would agree with as to why a military option in Iran should be pursued. We've got regime change. I've spoken regularly. I think the big problem in Iran is not their nuclear weapons program. It's not their enrichment. It's not their support for proxies. It's not their ballistic missile program. It's the Iranian regime. And all of those things are symptoms of the main problem. So I do think an argument for regime change could be made. Now, the American people may or may not be on board with that, but I think that's a viable argument. Of course, the support for the proxies that have American blood on their hands, that is a viable argument that could be made to the American people, as, of course, is their nuclear program. I want to add some caveats here that, of course, there's a lot of information we don't know. So what we just went through was a number of official statements being made that were pushed back on by people that would not have access to the newest, most classified intelligence assessments. However, when we're talking about the president and the government needing to make the case to the American people for war, you can't do that by saying it's all classified, we can't show you the evidence, just trust us, especially when we're talking about the lead up to the Iraq invasion, barely 20 years ago, relying on intelligence that proved to be, at the very least, exaggerated, if not outright false. And I also want to be clear-eyed on the possibilities here. We should remember that in Venezuela, just barely a month ago, the United States carried out a military operation that I don't think anybody really expected or saw coming. Of all of the different options we had lined up in Southcom, I think very few people expected that we'd be able to fly special operators in the dead of night, capture Maduro in his home, alive, as well as his wife, and exfil him with no personnel lost and no equipment lost. That was a shockingly effective operation. Iran is very, very different than Venezuela in a lot of ways. The capabilities there are night and day. However, I bring that up to say that the United States historically does have a couple tricks up our sleeve. But whether you think that going into Iran or not is a good idea, I am kind of in the camp that that case needs to be made to the American people, and it has not been yet. The Wall Street Journal, again, this is generally viewed as a conservative outlet, and I would argue that most of the people at the Wall Street Journal would like to see the Iranian regime collapse. So this is a group that would generally be in favor, kind of traditional conservatives in the United States, would generally be in favor of military action against Iran with the goal of regime change. Keep that in mind. They say, quote, it's time for the commander-in-chief to explain his thinking on Iran to the American people. There are excellent reasons to take military action now against the weakened revolutionary regime, but Mr. Trump has never made a sustained case for doing so. Mr. Trump has put himself in a position where there is risk no matter what he decides. His way out is to explain why he thinks he must act now on Iran. If he asks for support in advance from Congress and the public, he will have more allies if the war doesn't go exactly as planned, which it rarely does. The upside is a chance to weaken or topple a regime that promises death to America and give the Middle East a new chance for peace. Again, I think what a lot of folks are interested in here, me personally as well, is what is the case being made? You might think that the argument for or against is enough. Right, let's talk about protesters, for instance. There might be people that say, yes, we should risk our sons and daughters and our military resources to go over there to avenge the protesters. Others might say, no, that's not worth it. It was a horrible tragedy, but we're not going to risk our military to do that. Maybe regime change is enough of an argument to be made. None of that is really coming out right now. We're just getting the Iran is bad. Here are the reasons they're bad. And I think most people probably agree with that. But what we tend to see right now is more and more testing of the messaging. In fact, there was a report in Politico that came out a couple days ago saying there's actually some of the administration that are kind of hoping that Israel actually goes first, because if we're just there protecting an ally, it's a much easier case to make to the American people. Politico said, quote, senior advisors to President Trump would prefer Israel strike Iran before the United States launches an assault on the country, according to two people familiar with ongoing discussions. These Trump administration officials are privately arguing that an Israeli attack would trigger Iran to retaliate, helping muster support from American voters for a U.S. strike. The calculus is a political one, that more Americans would stomach a war with Iran if the United States or an ally were attacked first. Recent polling shows that Americans, and Republicans in particular, support regime change in Iran, but are unwilling to risk any U.S. casualties to achieve it. That means Trump's team is considering the optics of how an attack is conducted in addition to other justifications, such as Iran's nuclear program. The U.S. intelligence community is concerned and monitoring potential asymmetric retaliation by Iran on U.S. facilities and personnel in the Middle East and Europe, per a senior U.S. intelligence official. Again, I feel it's weird at this point that so much of the conversation is around the framing and how can we get more people to say, yes, we should do that thing, when there are, again, I think, viable reasons. Just dig in on the nuclear argument. Just dig in on the ballistic missiles. Just dig in on the proxies, something. But none of that is really being hammered home. And the times it is brought up, from what we've seen in recent days, is pretty grossly exaggerated, at least based off of what we have publicly available. And the reason this is so important right now is that it looks like strikes could happen any day. I mean, just yesterday, negotiations fell through to nobody's surprise. The Associated Press said Iran and the United States held hours of indirect negotiations Thursday over Tehran's nuclear program, but walked away without a deal. Just before the talks ended, Iranian state television reported that Tehran was determined to continue enriching uranium, rejected proposals to transfer it abroad, and sought the lifting of international sanctions, indicating it was not prepared to meet President Trump's demands. Iran has maintained that it has the right to enrich uranium and does not want to discuss other issues like its long-range missile program or support for armed groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. There is a valid argument here that the talks have never actually been aimed at achieving anything substantial, and that we went into it because we needed to check that box and say, hey, we at least tried the diplomatic route. I think there's some validity to that because we've been moving assets into the region, and anybody that really follows this knows that the claims that we laid out, there is no way that Iran was just going to accept that at all. Like that's not on the table. We're asking the Iranian regime to negotiate their downfall in a lot of ways. It's kind of absurd to think that they would just out of nowhere say, you know what, today, actually, now that it's February, let's do that. It wasn't in the cards, which, I do think the Trump administration believed that enough pressure in the form of looking like we were going to carry out military strikes might move the needle a little bit. It hasn't. And where we are today is starting to see evacuations across the region. The Times of Israel said the U.S. State Department on Friday authorized non-emergency personnel and the family members of those stationed in Israel to leave the country due to safety risks, with U.S. Ambassador Mike Huckabee reportedly telling embassy staff that if they want to leave Israel, they should do so today. They say the embassy's call for non-emergency staff to depart, issued in a security alert, quote, will likely result in a high demand for airline seats today, Huckabee wrote in an email to staffers in Israel, according to the New York Times. Focus on getting a seat to anywhere from which you can then continue travel to D.C., but first priority should be getting out of the country being Israel. He said there is no need to panic, but for those desiring to leave, it's important to make plans to depart sooner rather than later. There's a lot of lines that have happened in the last few weeks of you're waiting for this one thing to get into place before the strikes are imminent. There's been a lot of that. This is just the newest. And we did see the evacuation of U.S. personnel from a variety of locations across the Middle East prior to the kickoff of the 12-day war and Operation midnight hammer. We are seeing a number of other countries as well calling their citizens to leave Iran as well as Israel. This list is constantly being updated, but the most recent I've seen calling for their citizens to leave Iran is China, Canada, Sweden, India, Poland, Germany, Brazil, and others. And then the United States, Australia, Canada, Germany, and more have asked their citizens to at least consider leaving Israel. The terminology there gets a little tricky. Sometimes it is a forced evacuation. I don't think that is the case quite yet in any of these. It's more just a warning. Something's about to happen or could happen. Your life could be at risk. If you have the opportunity, it's probably best to get out of these two countries. Now, when we look at how Iran might respond, of course, one of the major considerations is a large-scale attack on Israel, which is why we are seeing a number of countries evacuate their personnel from there. The Wall Street Journal reported, quote, Iran has warned that it would treat any attack, however limited, as a trigger for an all-out war. And I do think that's something we need to consider when looking at what the United States might do here in the coming hours, days, or weeks, is the 12-day war really destroyed a lot of Iran's capabilities. They do not have the proxy network today that they did 2 years ago, even further than that. Their missile program has been degraded. Their launchers have been destroyed. So they are in a weakened state. They are a cornered animal, in a sense. If you go after them, we do risk that one of the options is this kind of all-out attack on everything, trying to get as much damage inflicted as quickly as possible. In fact, an Israeli daily paper, Hayom, I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, earlier today talked about the possibility of a doomsday order. They say such an order, if it exists, would not deal with destroying Iranian infrastructure, but rather issuing a go command to the entire axis of resistance, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Hamas, and the militias, to fire everything they have. And I wanted to bring that up for two reasons. First off, I think the proxy threat is overblown at this point. It is still a thing, but we've seen significant degradation of the proxies since October 7th. So Hamas is not the same threat to Israel, certainly not to the Middle East, that they were prior to October 7th. Hezbollah has been defanged in a lot of ways. The Houthis do still have quite a bit of capability. We should expect if the Houthis retaliate to focus their attacks really on shutting down the Red Sea and going after U.S. naval assets in the region. The militia groups across Syria and Iraq are a little bit degraded from where they once were. It's not clear if they would immediately jump to Iran's response. And we have to remember that every one of those militias is kind of a small government in of itself. They do want to act in their own best interest. We have not seen evidence that Iran has a button that they can push and every one of their proxies acts in Iran's best interest, which sometimes could be contrary to their own. We've seen these militias in Iraq and Syria, when they did launch deadly attacks against U.S. forces, I think it was 2024, the U.S. retaliated significantly, and we saw those attacks largely stop. It would have been in Iran's best interest had they continued, but those groups kind of one at a time said, you know what? Not worth it. We're going to dial it back a little bit, as then it might look like their strategy might be one of pressure on the United States, not necessarily with a desire, right now at least, to take American lives. So I'm not sure that Iran has the ability to push that button and get all of their proxies to fire at once. However, Iran does internally have that, and we have seen some unverified, so take this with a grain of salt, reports that launch authority for some of the missiles has been sent down the chain of command. And that's something that, if it were to happen, would increase the likelihood of Iran being able to get multiple missiles off when the first wave of attacks begins. If you assume that there is a single or even just a relatively small group of individuals that can sign off on launching ballistic missiles, if the United States or Israel were to take them out or take the communications network out in the first wave, you might have a lot of missile silos and mobile missile launchers waiting for their orders and not sure if they could go. If that go order has been pushed down the chain of command and they've authorized relatively junior officers to make that decision, it increases the likelihood that we go after certain targets and a varied missile launchers across the country see those explosions, see those strikes, drive their launchers out, and start sending those towards Israel, UAE, Qatar, U.S. bases, or maybe even U.S. ships in the region. So I do think that's a consideration, maybe not the exact way that Israel Harom wrote it up. But either way, it does look like as we near the weekend, we know President Trump historically has liked to take action when the markets are closed. Here in the United States, that happens in about 3 hours. So we'll see. This could be a rather kinetic weekend, to say the least. But that's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.